Welcome to the Mindset Matters series. I'll introduce you to my colleague, Kim, who's going to start us off.
Louise. So we wanted to welcome everyone to the Mindset Matters series where shared experiences connect people. I am Kim Grant. I'm a care manager with the Encompass program, and we have Louise Hansen with us as well. She's a social worker and our manager of customized programs. Today, we are really privileged to have retired police officer Dan Jones with us. Dan retired from the Edmonton Police Service after 25 years of service. Patrol, the Undercover Operations and Gang Unit, Professional Standards Branch, and Homicide Section as a detective. He was also a staff sergeant for the General Patrol and an inspector with the Investigative Support Branch, Downtown Division Patrol and Research Unit. He's earned a master's degree in applied criminology from the University of Cambridge, and he is currently a PhD candidate with Huddersfield University. We'd also like to mention that Dan and his brother Scott Jones, who's a superintendent for Edmonton Police, host an interesting podcast called Just Us on justice and other things, and we definitely encourage you to check that out. Today, Dan is going to chat with us about his journey of policing in a variety of roles and how the trauma he encountered impacted his life. He will courageously share his story, what prompted his outreach for help, how the trauma shaped his life and those in his life, his experiences and journey with his wellness and recovery, and his approach for managing ongoing responses to trauma stimuli. He will also share his transition into retirement and how he managed to do the work and the work that he must still do. So before we begin, just a couple of housekeeping points. We've purposely disabled everybody's cameras and microphones so that everyone can participate anonymously. We'll record the presentation and host it on the Encompass website to enable access for those who may have missed it. However, we will stop recording once we start the Q&A. Please feel free to submit questions through the Q&A feature on your Zoom. Those questions will be answered by the Encompass team, and we will read them out to ensure anonymity.
I'm just going to interject. Sorry, Kim, to interrupt you, but we're actually not going to stop the recording for the questions for the Q&A. My apologies. We did that initially with a series, but the questions are such a rich part of the discussion, and so we'll keep them anonymous by us reading them out, but we'll continue the recording right to the end.
Thanks. Perfect. That sounds great. If you would like to comment to let Dan know that you're hearing what he's saying, we kind of use A as being awesome and OOO as a standing ovation. So if you'd like to use those, you can feel free to do so. So with that, we want to turn things over to Dan so that he can tell us a little bit more about his story in policing and what drew him to this career. So welcome, Dan. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm honored to be asked to do this. I'm humbled as well. It's interesting. I grew up in a police family. My dad was a police officer. My uncle was a police officer. Everyone who was around my house was a police officer, because my dad kind of only had police friends, which I'll caution anyone who's new to policing, don't do that. Expand your friend base. It's June 28th. Today, and it's an interesting month because this month means things to certain people. I'm talking to you from Treaty 6 territory. It's Indigenous Peoples Month. I have a little pride pin on because it's the Pride Month. It's also Men's Mental Health Month, and I think that one gets forgotten. I think it is overshadowed by all the other things that happen. So I'm going to talk about, it's funny because when I went back to school, all my research is on trauma. I research the trauma of individuals who experiencing offending behavior. We've interviewed over 800 incarcerated men and women, both in provincial and federal prisons, and we've talked about their trauma. But today I get to talk about my own and my own journey through that. And I think it's one of those things that we don't talk about enough. Like I said, I grew up in a police family. My childhood was good and tumultuous at the same time. I grew up in the 80s, so we drank from the hose and weren't allowed in the house, and we would be gone from dusk till dawn, and we really didn't. I think we're the last of the feral children generation. So I grew up in that environment, and there was things in my childhood, but we don't need to talk about that right now. But I went from that and I started actually working in the justice system when I was 19 years old. I actually got hired and I went into prisons at 19. And being a 19-year-old child, because when we really understand what is a child now, we're not developed mentally until we're at least 24 years old. Our frontal lobes are not developed. So as a child, I went into prison. I started working at the Young Offender Center. And it was interesting because there were people in the Young Offender Center that were older than me because they were doing young offender time and hadn't been sent to adult. And at 19, I started there, and then I moved to adult prisons. I worked in the provincial prison, and then I worked in the federal maximum security prison when I was 21. And I did that until I became hired as a police officer at 22. Now, no one told me going into policing or going into the prison system that there was going to be an impact on my mental health. It's interesting because I come from a policing family. No one told us. No one told myself or my brother that there were going to be things that we're going to see that we can't unsee, things that were going to change us forever, and things that were going to impact us physically and psychologically. So my career was briefly touched upon. I started in downtown division patrol. So downtown Edmonton is our inner city. That was where I first started. And as a 22-year-old, started to see things that we all see in policing. It's just what it is. And back then, the expectation was you just suck it up. You just suck it up and you keep going. So in my personal life, I was hired in policing in June 2nd of 1997. And on June 12th of 1997, my wife and I had a son that was born and died at birth. He died of he was early. He had a heart attack at birth. And the decision I got to make at 22 years old was he could live, but he might have a terrible quality of life. What do you want to do? Do you want us to save him or do you want to let him go? So I made the decision. My wife was there, but obviously just having given birth, not as capable of decision making because she was in extreme pain because it was at birth early. And when you have birth early, your body's not ready for it. And that decision has haunted me forever. So that's one of those traumas that I hold. But the reason I bring it up specifically is early on in my career, I didn't tell anybody that going to a SIDS death or going to any type of baby death would have a significant impact on me. So I just did it. I just went to those things. Not telling anyone because I didn't want to seem weak. I didn't want to seem less than. I didn't want people to think I was a weak human being, rather than understanding later in life that would just make you a strong human being when you can give your boundaries. But I didn't know that back then. So that was me in downtown division. I remember specifically going to a SIDS death call. And then I remember specifically acting like an asshole, pardon my swearing, for the next 5 to 10 days because it just sat there and it just sat there and it just sat there and I did nothing with it other than be angry. I remember working downtown division and then I moved into Beats in 3 years. And in our downtown core, we had a very high sex trade worker area. And I remember being angry a lot that sex trade workers were having healthy babies. My wife, who wouldn't even drink caffeine, couldn't have a healthy baby. And after we lost Nikki, our son, before Nikki and just after Nikki, we had the 7 miscarriages. And eventually we had our daughter, Emma, which was great. But all of these things kind of sit with you and if you don't address them, they just kind of sit and they just toil into you. And I saw an analogy recently where someone said, take a piece of cheesecake and put it in a purse, put it in a $3,000 purse. What happens to that cheesecake in 5 days, 10 days, 1 year? It actually comes alive because it starts to rot. And if you eat it, it might make you real sick. And that's what we do with our trauma. We put it in a purse or we put it in a trunk and we let it fester. And if we don't address it, it can make us sick. It can make us both physically and emotionally sick. So moving through my career, I go through Beats, I go through undercover operations. And that's the other thing is as police officers, as first responders, we have to understand the impact that our actions have on our partners and our children. And I don't think we talk about that enough. I called my wife once from Kelowna. I live in Edmonton. If you know where Kelowna is, it's not anywhere near Edmonton. I called my wife from Kelowna when I was undercover, and I said, I'm not going to be home for I don't know how long, maybe 2 weeks. And I don't know when I'm going to talk to you again. Tell the kids I love them. And you think about that when your spouse now is thinking about you and the fear that is potentially there, that something's going to happen to you, regardless if that's a perceived fear or a real fear. Your spouse or partner, your kids don't have a clue what's going on with you, and you're living a different life as specifically an undercover operator. So we did that, and I did that for a year, and oftentimes would be disappointing to my family, because undercover operations is undercover operations, and you miss weddings and you miss birthdays and you miss major events in your family because you have to be that person for someone else in the undercover setting. And that does take a toll on you or me, the person doing it, as well as the family. And I think we don't talk about that enough at all. And then I moved from undercover operations to gang unit. And this is where some interesting things and unfortunate things happened. While I was in gang unit, I actually had a death threat. I had a contract put on my head by an organized crime group. And my house had to be alarmed, where my children had to carry panic alarms, and my wife had to carry a panic alarm, and we had to notify the school. And we had all of these things occurring. And you have to realize that the continuous impact on both the individual who's experiencing it and the family members who were experiencing it. And I think my biggest failure at the time was thinking about what it did to them. To me, I was arrogant, I was young, and I was like, yeah, well, I don't want to be moved. I want to stay where I am. And if they want to come get me, they can come get me. And I have that kind of stupid, toxic masculinity attitude, if you will, about it. And it even got to the point where our neighbors got involved, because the tactical team came and took pictures of inside our house. When they went to the neighbors' houses to determine where the best places for snipers to set up would be if our house got taken. So you start to not only impact your family, but you start impacting the other people around you. And we do that, unfortunately, without talking about or addressing the psychological impacts that has on everyone, including myself. I went from gang unit, I got promoted to professional standards branch, where I investigated other police officers, which was fine. An interesting thing happened to me when I was doing that, though. I ran a wiretap on a member of the Edmonton Police Service. I'd run wiretaps on gang members before this. And it was interesting because when I ran the wiretap on the gang members, they said really nice things about me. I never actually heard a negative word said about me by the gang members. When I ran a wiretap on the police officers, it wasn't quite as kind. So you start to align yourself and realize where you fit into this space, where you fit into who actually are your people. And I'm going to jump back to earlier on in my childhood. In 1982, I was in grade 2, and the teacher called my parents at about 9 o'clock at night. I remember this vivid call where the teacher called and said, Danny is retarded, as her actual words were, and he's got a low IQ, and he's going to have to go to special class. And I remember in 1982, I got removed from my class and put into a special class called the resource room. And I lost all my friends because nobody wanted to be friends with the kids in the resource room. And that was an early on what I now understand as a trauma, a betrayal trauma. And it links back to the whole policing thing, because who are your people? And when they took me for exam testing when I was a kid, and shortly after I went through the testing, they found out my IQ wasn't in the low 70s. It was higher than that, and I could go back to regular class. I was just bored, is what they said. But then the friends that didn't want to be my friends wanted to be my friends again. So early on, I learned about loyalty. I learned about self-reliance. And I became very, very self-reliant at an age of grade 2. And I've carried that through my whole life, where I've never relied. That's not true. Up until, I'll tell you when, there's a point in time in my story where I started to rely on someone else, and that someone else was my wife. But I didn't rely on anyone. And I think that's really dangerous. And I read a quote once, and it hit me pretty hard. It was, I'm not the kind of person that has people. I'm the kind of person that people have. Because for whatever reason, people come to me and they tell me their deepest, darkest secrets, and they ask me for advice. And I think there's a whole study on empaths now, and I think I would be qualified or classified as an empath, where people come to you and they just want to share, they want your help, or they whatever, and you suck that energy up. But anyway, so as I'm moving through professional standards branch, I go into a homicide section where that was my goal. My entire goal of policing was to walk 118th Avenue foot patrol, which I did, and to be a homicide detective. And I go into homicide, and this is where my psychological well-being changed significantly. I was ultra arrogant. I thought that homicide couldn't actually exist without me. I thought I was the only person that was able to do it among the people, including my brother who was in there with me. And I went to a call that really changed my trajectory of life and mental stability, actually. It was the death of 2 children. I won't go into details of anything other than the fact that they were wearing Cars pajamas. They were 6 and 4 years old, and their dad murdered them. And it was just before Christmas. And that incident, that homicide, made me start to believe that I was responsible for everything, and no one else could do it. And that responsibility for everything meant I was responsible for everything homicide, but I had to pass up family. And at one point in time, I actually said to my wife, who has been with me since we were teenagers, I said, you will not come first, second, or third. You will always come after the homicides, because if your grandma dies, you need me and your family needs me to be there for them. And that's the most important thing. You can take care of the kids, and I will take care of the homicides. And I'm not going to lie to you, that's a stupid thing to say to your wife. It didn't go very well. Resulted in me and my wife not living together for a period of time. For me, for about 8 months, I lived at my mom and dad's, which was not cool at all. But my wife was very, very protective and amazing, where she called my mom up and said, I'm worried about Danny. Someone needs to take care of him, and I can't anymore because he's not here. And that was a real hard thing for me to hear later after I heard about it. It was one of those things that I didn't, I'd never had anybody kind of look out for me before. I'd never had anybody try to take care of me before. I kind of always did it all myself. So for 8 months, I toiled, and I was living in my mom and dad's house. And I think sometimes things happen for a reason, I guess I would say. I don't know always what those reasons are. But while I was separated from my wife, I slipped on the ice and I broke my leg. I've had a physical break. And that stopped me from being at work for a while. And then it also made me rely on her because I couldn't drive because I had a broken leg. And I honestly don't think if I broke my leg, I don't know if I'd be here today. Because during that 8 months, not only was I fully experiencing arrogance and whatever, but I was also suicidal at the time. There were more than one time in that period of time where I actually had loaded my gun and thought about killing myself. And it was that weird imbalance of I have to be responsible for everything, but I think I need to end my life because I can't be responsible for everything, and I have too much on my shoulders. It was at that time my wife had said to me early on when we were split up that I needed to go get some help. And I was livid when she said that. I was like, that's ridiculous. I don't need help. I'm not weak. And then when I did go get some help, I said to her, if you tell anybody about this, I'll never talk to you again. Because I didn't want anyone to know that I was going for therapy. I didn't want anyone to know that I was weak. Understanding now that wasn't weak at all. That was the strongest thing I ever did. So that was through homicide, and I got my wife and I got back together, and I went through therapy, and I felt like I'd won the game, right? I'm fixed now. I'm all done my mental health journey. I'm fixed, I'm healthy, I'm good, and I've hit the finish line. Spoiler alert, there's no finish line. It's a journey. It's a continuous journey. Move on through my rest of my career. I go into be a staff sergeant in the West Division, which was great. And I was a staff sergeant in charge of Indigenous in the Indigenous unit. I developed our Indigenous people strategy. Then I got promoted to inspector. Now, here's the two different stresses that I've experienced in my life: operational stress and organizational stress. And I don't think we pay enough attention to the latter. We oftentimes, and I think policing is really good at the acute mental health. If somebody is suicidal, if somebody is in a crisis, I think we're really good at that. I think Ontario's, with you and with Dalton, I think has changed the game, which is, I think that Encompass process should be around the entire country. But I look at, we're not good at any preventative stuff, and we're not good at long-term mental health and policing for the most part. So I go in and I go into this inspector rank, which was great at first, until me and the chief didn't get along. And then all of a sudden, when you and the chief don't get along, you and a whole bunch of people don't get along, because everybody tends to want to be liked by the chief because that's how you get promoted and that's how you get different things. So all of a sudden I had, again, very similar to my experience in grade 2. I had people that I had worked with, people that I was in units with, that I considered friends, completely turn their back on me because of my relationship with the chief. These people I worked in gang unit with, in professional standards branch, they no longer would talk to me. They would ignore me. They would talk about me. They would talk behind my back on a regular basis. And all of a sudden, I went through that same thing I went through in 1982 again in the organization. And that's a betrayal, and that's a trauma of betrayal, which is a big trauma. And we don't talk about that enough. And I think we don't want to use the word trauma when it comes to that. It's a trauma. And so as I'm sitting there, as I'm going through this with these individuals, I start to become completely self-reliant again. And what actually happened, one of the things that actually happened was, I was at a conference, a community conference, where I actually said that police are losing, this is in 2017. I said, police are losing community support. And there's going to be a matchbox incident in the next 3 to 5 years that's going to change policing forever. And the police need to get back to the community where they belong and start developing relationships again. Unfortunately, predicting George Floyd. And when I did that, that got the chief so mad that he actually put an article out to the entire organization, not naming me, but it was called Words Matter. And he basically talked about that, me saying that in the news, and then I basically was an idiot. So he put out to the entire organization that I was an idiot. And the entire organization knew exactly what it was about, because I had people that worked for me, worked with me, and they were like coming up to me, if this can happen to you, how can we actually be honest in the community, blah, blah, blah. And it was kind of brutal. And then they moved me from my area that I was in. I was in charge of a whole bunch of things, and one of them which being community relations, basically. And they put me in a division with a superintendent that was told to keep me muted. So I ended up working with a superintendent I had worked with before, who was a bit of a bully. I don't let people bully me, but he tried. And it was really interesting. It was an interesting time, because I'm sitting there as an inspector with a chief that hates me, who would fire me if he could. And all the people that I used to be friends with have turned their back on me because the chief doesn't like me. Now, interestingly enough, we had a change in the chief while I was in that role. And the chief that came in as the current chief now, actually, I knew him from before. I was the only one in the organization that knew him from before. And the week or 2 weeks before he was the chief of police in Edmonton, we were at a conference together in Toronto, on the Law Enforcement Public Health Conference. And he and I were chatting about, I asked him if he applied for the Edmonton police chief job, and he said no. And then when he walked in the room, I was like, he lied to me. But he was right in the middle of contract negotiations, so he couldn't tell me the truth. So he came up immediately after he got announced. He walked over to me and he shook my hand and gave me a hug and said, I'm so sorry I lied to you. I didn't intend to, I had to. As soon as the other members that treated me badly with the old chief saw that the new chief knew me, they became my friends again, or they tried to become my friends again. And it was right back to grade 2 again. I've got these people that now want to be my friend, that treated me terribly growing up through the organization, through that time period. And now they want to be my friend, and they're just, hey, Danny boy. And then they started to excuse their behavior because they said it was really hard to work for the previous chief. Now, stupidly and annoyingly made me angry because they were defending that chief to the nth degree. He was the best chief we ever had. He's bringing the organization this way. And that's when that organizational stress becomes a significant issue. And I'm going to go back to what I said very, very early on. If you're new in this organization, if you're new into policing, make sure you maintain friendships out of policing, because friendships in policing can be significantly fickle when it comes to promotion, when it comes to organizational stress, when it comes to those things. And you need to maintain who you were before, because we forget that we're not just the badge that we carry. And I think one of the things that we do in policing is identify too strongly with what we do, right? We carry a badge, we are cops, we say things and we talk and we have a special bond, which is good with the people that we work with, because we experience trauma with them. But trauma bonding isn't always healthy. And one of the things we have to do is we have to make sure that we maintain who we are prior to what we are, right? There's a big difference. You're not just a police officer. You're not just a first responder. You are who you are first. I'm Dan Jones. And I started writing, later in my career, I started writing my rank after my name. Dan Jones, Inspector, Downtown Division. Because when I would put it before my name, that's who I am. Nope, that's what I am. I'm an inspector in Downtown Division. I'm Dan Jones first. And I started realizing that later in my career. We're given retirement badges when we retire. I don't carry mine. It's in a drawer, and my kids can have it when I die, and it's something cool that they can say they have. But I don't identify with it. And I actually early on, and not early on in my career, but probably midway through my career, I got to meet a guy by the name of Roy Hazelwood. And I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with who that is, but Roy Hazelwood is actually one of the individuals who started, along with John Douglas, a very famous author, who started the behavioral assessment unit for the FBI. Roy Hazelwood and John Douglas are actually, if you watch Criminal Minds, the characters are based off, two of the characters are based off him. Rossi is based off John Douglas, the author, the kind of the flamboyant out there guy. And Gideon was based off Roy Hazelwood, the quiet, mindful individual who kind of sat in the background without being noticed. And Roy Hazelwood said very early on in my career, and it was something that stuck with me. He said, do not be the badge. Do not identify as you as that badge, because you're not, you're something different. And that stuck with me because I love my dad. My dad still carries his retirement badge in his wallet, and he's been retired he retired the year I graduated. He's been retired for 25 years now, and he still carries that badge every day. And he still identifies himself as and he talks about he bleeds blue. And we have to make sure we're more than that, because the next phase of my story is understanding that. So I go through all the operational stress, the organizational stress. And then when the new chief comes in, I get put into a position where I'm in the room with the chief and the deputies that treated me like shit for 18 months. For 18 months, I threw up before work every day. I threw up before work every day because I had a stress response, an anxiety response to going into that room that was unsafe. And I don't mean that like I was walking into a gang drug house. I mean unsafe psychologically and emotionally. And again, and specifically men, we're afraid to talk. I think we're afraid to talk about being in unsafe spaces because we don't want to seem not manly enough, not strong enough. But that's not true. You have to identify those things, because if you don't, they will sit and they will fester inside you like that cheesecake in a purse, and it will make you sick. And it made me sick. I wasn't doing well, but I'd go to work every day and I would throw up, and I would go to work and I would be around people that were unsafe. And there was no choice. And I sat there and multiple times thinking, how the heck can I leave? How can I leave policing? My entire goal in life as a child was to be a cop. And I loved my job for the vast majority of the time I did it. Probably too much at times, where I put my family second, like I talked about earlier. But I started to really want to leave policing. I started to really want to exit it. And I was very lucky later in life to go back to school, to get my master's degree, working on my PhD. So it wasn't like I didn't have options, but we often, the pension, I was tied to the pension concept, right? Is if I left before I was hit my 25 years, and the way it works in Edmonton, I think it's different in Ontario, different places are different. But in Edmonton, it's a 25 and 0. At 25 years, I get 50% of my best 5 years for the remainder of my wife and my life. If I left before 25 years, I had to wait till I was 55 to collect my pension. So I started at 22. So I was 47 when I retired. So I would have had to wait till I was 55 to start collecting pension. And that math just made no sense. So the math was, yeah, I need to stay, even though it's unhealthy for me. I need to stay because I need to hit that 25-year mark. And I did. I hit the 25-year mark, and I ended up taking a job at a federal healing lodge for federal inmates for 6 months. But I realized while I was doing that I couldn't be in the system anymore. And I was sending people back to prison for sometimes stupid reasons. And I am a very left-leaning individual who believes that people deserve second chances. Partly because if I wasn't given second chances in my life, I wouldn't be here. I had some very, very unhealthy behaviors as a kid. I actually carried a gun to school in grade 8 and 9. I pulled it on a kid and almost shot a kid in school. I got arrested for assault causing bodily harm on my 18th birthday, but I got let go because my dad was my dad. And so I had these behaviors, these unsafe behaviors as a kid, and I got second chances for them. And I believe in second chances for others. So working in the healing lodge just didn't work for me. And then I also had a very toxic boss again, who was very similar to the chief that wanted me fired. So I actually one day I'm very fortunate. I'm not Indigenous at all, but I'm very fortunate. Indigenous culture has really helped me in my healing journey. I sweat a lot, I smudge a lot. So I actually smudged, and I asked Creator, what do I do? Like, what do I do right now? Like, I'm struggling, I'm stressed. I left policing, I've gone to this new job, I'm stressed again. And my wife even said, you're answering your phone the same, you're not retired, you're actually ramping it up again. She's like, do whatever you want, but I don't think it's good for you. And the day after I smudged, I got a phone call from Northwest College, from the chair of the justice program, that said, hey, we have a position here. Are you interested? And I applied and I got it. And now I'm the chair of the justice program. But here's the kicker: when we retire, we do a really good job in policing of making sure people are healthy when they start. We do medicals, we do physicals, we do eye tests, we do hearing tests, we even do psychological testing. In Alberta, and I know you don't do this in Ontario, we even do a polygraph to make sure that you didn't lie about anything on your entrance exam and on your entrance papers. We do none of that when you leave. They don't check your physical health, they don't check your mental health, they don't check on your wellness. They just say, here's your watch and congratulations, here's your retirement badge, and hope everything goes well for you. So this is the next journey and part of my journey. And I know I don't have a ton of time, but I'm going to talk about it. I leave policing, I leave justice, and I go into this job at Northwest College, which is actually a wonderful place to work. My bosses are amazing. It's a healthy environment. No one's trying to climb over me to get somewhere. There's no talk behind your back. No one's, like I always said, you don't have to talk about yourself in a police organization. Because as soon as you leave the room, it'll be done for you. And that's unfortunately the culture of policing does have. And I come into this space, and all of a sudden I am stressed. I'm having anxiety attacks. I'm having panic attacks. I don't understand what's going on. My wife is worried about me. And she again says, you need to go get some help. And this is why I said that help that I got when I was in a homicide 10 years ago, it's not a finish line. So I go to this new therapist. I'm doing EMDR currently. which is a modality of bilateral somatic stimulation that addresses the traumas in your body, and it works through your body. And it's been really great, but it's also been really hard. And I started to realize that I've never not been in crisis from childhood to now. And my therapist really actually said to me once, she said, did you have any early surgeries as a child? I'm like, yeah, I did. I had a double hernia when I was 6 months, and I was hospitalized for pneumonia when I was 6 weeks. She's like, those traumas still carry with you. You may not remember them, but those things all carry with you. They're all stuck in there. They're all working in your body. So doing EMDR, one of the things that I talked earlier about the homicide that really affected me was the Cars characters. If I saw those Cars characters, I would have a visceral response. I actually threw up in a superstore because I walked by and there was Cars characters on something and I had to leave the store. Through EMDR, I can look at those Cars characters now. They don't bug me because it's not that the trauma is not there, it's that I've metabolized that specific trauma. I'm currently metabolizing another part of my life, and it's been really challenging because it's not over in one day. Like, it's a lot of work, right? So EMDR, it's not like you do EMDR once and you're like, yep, high fives, we're out of here, we're healthy, we're feeling good. But what happens is trauma, it actually sits in your body, and a lot of people don't really realize that actually you get pain when you're working through it. Like I have right now, my rib cage is sore, my arm is sore, my chest is sore, and it's because the trauma that I'm working through is actually leaving my body in different ways. And I'll jerk, and I'll have like and that's negative energy leaving you. Now, one of the things that happened to me with this was, I worked through that trauma, which was great. Now I'm working with this trauma. And actually 2 days ago, this is timely as can be. 2 days ago, I'll back up. Saturday, my wife has to take her aunt to the hospital, and I'm doing the grocery shopping, which I always do, but I'm unloading the groceries, which I never do. And all of a sudden I have a pain in my chest, a pain in my arm, audio and ocular occlusion for about a second and a half. And then it goes away. Now, here's the other thing that comes with post-traumatic stress disorder and a lot of mental health issues is catastrophic thinking. So I have this all the time, and you'll probably find funny because I find it funny, but I'll tell you that story after. So my catastrophic thinking is I'm having a heart attack. My stupid thinking is I'm not going to tell anybody about it because it'll go away, right? So I say nothing. I say nothing to my wife about it. That night, the next day, I wake up and I was terribly off. I was just off. I wasn't feeling great. I was kind of dizzy at times. My legs felt wobbly because I was having an anxiety attack because I thought I had a heart attack and I didn't tell anybody about it. At 9 o'clock at night, I go to bed. Well, I go to bed, and I never go to bed that early. I go to bed, and now I'm scared to fall asleep because I'm scared I won't wake up. But I haven't told anybody about it because I'm back in that self-reliant space where and which is one of my negative self-traits, is when things happen, I go back to that I'm all I have, rather than knowing that I have my amazing wife beside me. And I wake up, and then the next day I go to work on Monday, and I have the same thing happen with my chest and my arm this Monday while I'm in a meeting. I leave them. I don't tell anyone, of course. Why would I? Because that would be a smart thing to do. Tell someone, maybe call an ambulance. I drive myself to the emergency ward at our Royal Alexander Hospital, and I get checked in. I check in for heart pains. They do an ECG on me. They do a full panel. I'm actually super healthy, and I'm not going to die of a heart attack. I have I have one risk of heart attack, and that's my age. And all of it, there's two things. I have a giant dog that's a baby. He's 10 months old, and I've been walking him a lot, and he's caused some musculoskeletal injury in my chest and my arm. So that was that. And the rest was just literally anxiety. And I can't push it harder that we need to take care of ourselves, both physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, because our bodies will tell us what we are not or what we aren't, what we need to do. And my body was telling me that you are stressed. And I am. I'm addressing it. I'm dealing with it. I'm going through therapy because that's what's important. I want to be here for a long time for my wife and my kids. I want to be the person that I can be with them, because if we don't take care of that, we make ourselves sick, we die, or we become people that people don't want to be around. And I want to be someone who people want to be around. I want to be something that my wife wants to be around in retirement, that my kids want to be around. And I realize that as hard of the work that it is, it's so, so important. I got a phone call yesterday. It was funny. One of my best friends, we grew up together. He ended up being an inmate of mine at the Fort Saskatchewan Penitentiary. And he was on that side of the law, and actually the vast majority of my friends were. I had several friends in the Max when I was there. But he called me yesterday, and we talked quite regularly, but it was just an interesting time because I had just got out of the hospital the day before, and he has been doing EMDR for his stuff, which is different than my stuff. But it's not, because trauma is trauma. And he was just saying to me, he's like, you are doing the right thing, and you're going to experience these things, because I had a significant panic attack yesterday because I went to the mall to go get glasses, and I walked into a room and it was full of people, and I was going to the food court. I was going to go get some lunch, and everything just happened again. Ocular occlusion, audio occlusion. And it was because I was in a room full of people, and I haven't dealt with some of the traumas of being in prison. And right now I'm pretty opened up. And one of the things that Artie said was, he made a comment about me being an empath. And he goes, when you're open like that and you walk into a room like that, you're sucking everyone else's energy in, because that's the person you are, and that's what you've always done. And usually when you're healthy and you're in a good space, that's okay. But when you're open and vulnerable, it's not okay. It becomes a real challenge to your insides, to your body, to your spirit, to your mind. And you have to really protect yourself from those things. And you have to protect yourself when you go to sleep at night, because you have to make sure that you are. And his therapist did something my therapist did, and I think it's a great idea, is because we're obviously working on a whole bunch of things. Part of it's working with your inner child and the you that you were when you weren't protected, the you that you were when you weren't safe, and telling those yous, your previous yous, your inner children, that they're safe before you go to bed every night, that we've got you and we're going to deal with this, and we're take care of you. And I know sometimes this kind of, some people might roll their eyes and go, what are you talking about, inner child? It's real. It's a true thing. Like, you have to start to think about who you were and what happened to you back then. And again, never ever look in the mirror and say, what's wrong with me? There's nothing wrong with you. But look in the mirror and ask, what happened to you? And that's how we have to get through these things, because we aren't just the badge. We aren't just cops. We aren't just first responders. We're who we are first. We are the people that entered this place, and we want to work as hard as we can when we leave it to be as healthy as we were when we entered it, or even healthier. And I think we can't do that if we don't address the fact that we have trauma. We can't do that if we don't address the fact that we can actually ask for help. And I'm speaking to everyone, but I'm really focusing on men, because men, we oftentimes say we're okay. How are you? I'm okay. Most of the time when you get that response, that person is not okay. They're fighting demons that they don't know how to deal with. And sometimes we fight those demons by pouring alcohol down our throats. We fight those demons by doing other unsafe behaviors. But the vast majority of people who I would suggest in law enforcement or first responders that are abusing alcohol aren't abusing alcohol to get drunk. They're abusing alcohol to silence the things that are in them so they can sleep at night. And I think we need to work at how to silence those things in a positive and healthy way. And that's through therapy and through whatever modalities there are. And it's not just one thing. It's not just therapy. I go to sweats. I have made it a point of pulling my earphones out of my head when I walk my dog, so I'm alone with my own thoughts, so I can be mindful of the space, that I can smell and listen to the trees, that I can pay attention outside. And it's about, exercise, and that sometimes we mistake exercise as wellness. Exercise is fitness, but it's a part of wellness. But it's not the only modality. That just because you run 20 kilometers a month or a week or whatever, and you work out, doesn't mean that you're well. You might be fit, but it doesn't mean that you're well. And we got to make sure that we address all the modalities that we have to make sure that we have a wellness plan for ourselves. And that goes far beyond just therapy. Therapy is one thing, but find the other things. Find a group of people that you could actually have meaningful, mindful conversations with about the things that are bothering you, and be honest. Find time to sit at least 5 minutes a day and look at the sky and sit in the sun and smell the earth. Find time to listen to the wind. And if you're religious, go to church. If you're spiritual, or if you're like, for me, the Indigenous community, I smudge, I sweat. And it took a long time for me to tell people that, because I felt like I was appropriating a culture that's not mine. And one of the elders said to me, "Where'd you get the medicines?" I'm like, "Well, I got them from elders." And they're like, "Well, that's the permission to use them." Like you didn't make it up. You've been given that permission. And years ago, I was really fortunate. I was given a Cree name. So I've been great. That community of Indigenous folks in this area that I'm in Treaty 6, has really been part of my healing journey. And I think, yeah, it's a journey, and there's no finish line. And I think that's it. I get some questions now, if you have any.
Oh gosh, thank you so much for sharing your story. I mean, as I sit and listen to you, you unpacked and shared so much. And clearly you're somebody who's done a lot of reflection, a lot of work, a lot of learning. And I so appreciate you coming here and sharing your vulnerability and your wisdom and everything that you did with us. I mean, I heard so many things. It's so obvious to you when you talk about your formative years, as a child, and understanding the linkages to your childhood experiences and traumas, and how those can essentially sneak up on you, when you're in a situation, and can really kind of take you down, right? And sometimes you may not even be aware of some of that. And so the really amazing messages that you gave around the importance of knowing yourself. I mean, it is who we are. It's our perception of traumatic experience, isn't it? That drives our reaction to the traumatic experiences. And so knowing who you are and what you bring into situations is so important. And I heard the whole piece around asking for help. And I don't know if you can comment on that a little bit further, because you've done a lot of work. That's one of your sticking points, right? When you're feeling vulnerable, you're less likely to ask for help. And I don't know if you have any guidance for others around how you get by that, how you get by that inability, that the stigma, the I need to be strong, so that you don't, so that you do take care of yourself.
I think it's the realization that there's strength in vulnerability. And I think that's one of the things we don't talk about enough, that when you're vulnerable, you're strong. I actually wrote a vignette in a textbook called Policing Vulnerable Populations. And I talked about being vulnerable with the vulnerable. And it was actually something I learned in policing, was when I was vulnerable, it was that there was a specific incident that occurred, and it taught me about vulnerability. And I later reflected on it and understood it more. I had a young lady who tried to kill herself, and she was like, you don't understand. And I said, what don't I understand? You don't understand losing a child. And I'm like, I do. And I talked about losing Nikki to her, and it really bonded us to the point where I was able to get her in the hospital. I was getting her to the doctor. I was able to get her to calm down. And we're taught in policing not to be vulnerable, right? We're taught that everyone's a threat. We're taught that, and then we're taught to be compassionate with that threat. Well, you can't be compassionate with something that's a threat. And if they don't look like you, they're a double threat. So what I learned was being vulnerable actually works. It helps you. It helps the system, the situation. And then I learned later in life that vulnerability is a superpower. And if you can be vulnerable enough, and when you are vulnerable and you ask for that help, you are not only helping yourself, you're helping all the loved ones around you. And I also really think that we need to talk about vulnerability as a strength way more, and we need to tease. And again, I'm gonna focus on men, because women seem to be way smarter than men, and they are willing to get help way more than we are. And they're willing to be vulnerable way more than we are, because we have somehow along the way talked about vulnerability as a weakness, and it's not. It's literally one of the biggest strengths that you have. And when I was early on my first therapy, and I didn't want to tell anybody, and I didn't want my wife to, I didn't want to go. I've been a very different person from that now. And I will, and if you listen to our podcast, we talk about this stuff all the time. We talk about mental health all the time, because we need to, because it hasn't been done enough. And for me, it's about knowing that your vulnerability is your strength. And when you are needing help, going to get it makes you a strong person, because that's going to make you be there for the people that you love for a lot longer than if you don't.
What about that blind spot when you're, you know, to use your words, being an asshole, but you don't, you think you're good, you're not, you know, people are telling you that you're not. What are some words of wisdom like that?
I don't know if there's any words of wisdom there other than listen to the people you love, because they know, right? Listen to the people that you love, because they're not telling you to hurt you, they're telling you to help you. And I think for me, one of the hard things was listening to people. Like after my wife and I got separated, my wife said something very interesting to me. She said, we've been together for, I don't know how many years I was at that time, but I don't know you at all. You've never told me anything about you. And I'm like, yeah. And she's like, you're a great listener and you're a great communicator, but you're do that without telling me anything about you. And even recently, within the last however many months I've been going to this therapy and doing this work with EMDR and talking about my childhood, my wife knew nothing about my childhood. And every day she's surprised. She's like, when I start talking, she's like, I can't believe that you went through that. I can't believe these things happened to you. Because I've never shared them, because I've always kept them hidden. And it's not about keeping things hidden. It's about being open and honest. And it's hard work. Like it really is. Like, and I'm not gonna sugarcoat it with anyone. When you do this, it is hard work, but you need to do it, because if you don't do it, the alternative is significantly worse.
And we know that healing happens in connection with others, right? And it sounds like now, even though you're doing your individual work, you are also sharing with your wife.
Mm-hmm. And
right?
that's the thing I'll also say is, if you go to a therapist and they're not the right therapist, don't stop going to therapy. Go get a different therapist. Because I actually went to a therapist before this one who I didn't get along with at all. I thought he was a fucking asshole, pardon my language. And he was rude and I didn't like him. My brother goes to him. My brother loves him. He was a jerk. I didn't like him at all. And I've got this new one and I love her. She is like within the first day, I was like, this woman is awesome. And she totally gets it. And it was an instant connection. And that's right. You have to be connected with the therapist too. You can't just go to therapy and not have a connection with that person, or else it's not going to work.
And it's not just about skill set or clinical experience or background. It's about who that person is, who that therapist is, and their ability to authentically connect with you. And so that's what they bring into the relationship as well. So you're right. You need to make sure that it's a good fit for you. And what you need at one point in your journey might be different than, what you need later on.
Like I did talk therapy first back in the day, and now I'm doing EMDR, which is totally different.
Yeah, very much so. So yeah, a couple questions here in the chat. Somebody thanking you so much for sharing your story, and now that you're retired and looking back, and this is really a very personal question, but would you pick a different career in policing and justice, kind of based on, what you've been through and how it's shaped who you are?
I wouldn't pick a different career. I would have done some things differently. I would have focused on my mental health earlier if I'd have known about it. One of the greatest gifts that policing gave me was a third daughter. So I have two bio daughters, Vanessa and Emma. And one's 30. She lives in Newmarket, Ontario, not far from you. And my other one's 25. But I arrested a young lady in 2005 for conspiracy to commit murder. And then I adopted her, traditionally adopted her after that when she was 19. And last year, I walked my oldest daughter down the aisle in Newmarket in Ferry Park. And then 7 days later, I walked Nicole down the aisle in Hawaii. And I've had people intersect in my life that have made this entire career worthwhile. And I've been able to see the good that comes out of it. I actually spend more time talking to people that I arrested than people that I worked with, which is kind of interesting. So no, I wouldn't do a different career, but I would do it differently.
Thank you. This question is kind of out of my league here, but I'll propose it to you. It will mean more to you. What are your thoughts on the federal government proposed expansion of MAID, Bill C7, coming into effect in March 2024? Do you know what that is?
I don't even know.
Okay, so I will read this to you. It says, to include people solely with mental illness, will it pose a risk to members with PTSD? Should support groups and policing speak out against this proposed expansion?
Yeah, I can't answer that because I don't know enough about it. So I apologize. That's not something I'm up on, unfortunately.
Okay. All right. Thought I would ask. Listen, the other area, you know, you talked kind of about your formative years and who you are as a person and what you bring into things. You also, I thought, really spoke really well to the transition of retirement. That can be a very, very difficult transition for people. You know, from a what's the word, preventative perspective, really being careful and mindful about diversifying who you are, right? So that you are not solely defined and to being a police officer, but you're, you know, Dan, who does policing. And can you talk just a little bit, any other words of wisdom around easing your way into retirement when you're in that pre-retirement window?
Yeah, I can't, because it's actually interesting. My brother is going through this right now. My brother he's been on for 30 years and he's starting to look at retirement. And me and him have talked about this a lot because he saw what I've gone through. It's about making sure that we have things to do. It doesn't mean you have to have another job. If you're financially set, you don't need another job. Your pension is going to keep you going. And like, what I always tell people is, I actually don't have a job. I have a hobby they pay me for. When I was in policing, I started teaching at university, and I was teaching just for fun. And it made me extra money, but the money didn't matter. It wasn't about the money. And now I'm teaching at a college, which I love doing. It's literally my hobby. So it's about finding things that you want to do, right? Like, and again, it doesn't have to be paid for stuff. If you want to volunteer somewhere, if you want, it's about being busy enough that you're not just sitting there, you know, toiling in the retirement thing. And I've watched, and I hate this, but I've watched far too many members retire and then die.
Yeah.
And I don't, it's that we also have to realize that we have been in crisis and not allowed to be out of it. We've not allowed ourselves to not be in crisis for the entire time we're on this roles, whether that's organizational or operational stress. It's a crisis-led job. We are, and when we all of a sudden we're not in crisis, we don't know what to do with that. And sometimes that might actually harm us. So it's about making sure that you know what you want to do after your retirement, whether that's employment or not, but finding those things that fill your soul, because policing is often referred to as a calling, and I would agree with that completely. But what's calling you next? And you got to figure that out. What's calling you next? And
it's busy with a purpose, isn't it?
Yes, it is, right? Like for me, it's educating people that are going into the justice system and being honest about it, right? Telling people this is what's going to happen to you. Your mental health is going to be impacted. You're going to see things that you can't unsee. You're going to be in positions and situations that are scary. And it's okay to be scared. And it's okay to be not okay. And it's okay to ask for help. And that's what my goal is now, is to have new people going into these systems to have those experiences and understanding of it.
Yeah. Dan, thank you so very much. I mean, the conversation is so important. And I so appreciate what you and your brother are doing as well in terms of having that conversation on a regular basis. I want to thank everybody who joined today's conversation. We are going to post it on the Encompas website, on the portal, for people to access again, or for people who weren't able to participate. Know that we're here. The Encompas program is here for you. Anybody that wants some support, wants to prepare some kind of preventative strategies for you as you're earlier maybe in your career, we're here 24/7. So anybody has questions to Dan, I don't know, Dan, if you're open to us forwarding those through to you.
Anytime. Yeah.
Okay. Well, listen, thank you so much. This was amazing. You are our last speaker for this season. I just want to let everyone know that we are taking a break, and we'll be back again in September. And we wish you all an amazing summer. So
I think my brother's your first speaker for the next one.
He is. Yeah, he is. Scott Jones will be here in September, the fourth Wednesday in the month, but we'll get some promotional material out in advance of that. So thank you. You all have a great day, and thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Dan.
Thank you.